the objective here was to complete all of the character arcs, because as you know, spoilers, this is the point where we actually leave these characters behind, and all of them have a journey they have to go on. So I'll talk a little bit more as we go through, but essentially the first character to deal with is Thomas's journey, and no one gets this except for like there's like 3 or 4 people, and that's my failing. That's absolutely my failing. But what I was going for, what I was hoping people would kind of take away from Thomas is a creative. He's someone who wants to make. Well, he doesn't start off wanting to make stuff that's cool. He's very interested in the world. He sees things. He's observant. He's having fun just looking at the world. And then he kind of discovers that he doesn't like certain things about this world. And that's the point during these levels where he decides to change things. He decides to create something, and he creates these new characters who go on to achieve what he wanted to achieve originally. And it's nice. It feels like a nice kind of illustration of that creative process of kind of creative people tend to, at least the ones I've met, tend to be really, really interested in everything, and I kind of like it's not part of the process that I've really seen depicted, and I kind of like the idea of Thomas being that guy who has to know why that thing works the way it does, and is intrigued by the world around him. And I don't think the players necessarily realise that straight away, but I hope that during these kind of levels you realise that that's the journey Thomas has come on, towards kind of becoming a creative or a creator. So this is a chance to do something that I'm surprised I don't do much of in the game up to this point, and I think I would probably go back and do a little bit more of it. Is moving targets. Is having targets where time is a factor in the placement as well. So here it's really simple. I basically have 2 position sets. And you just have to move your characters into one of those sets, which is fine. What's interesting is because the sets keep moving, most players, as they're putting this together, lose track of which set they're trying to build, and that's where the puzzle comes in, is just paying attention to which layout you're attempting. Both are possible, obviously, but doing half of one and half of the other is not it's not going to win you the level. So it's a fun one from that point of view. It kind of plays with players' perceptions a little bit. It's also quite a nice one-screen level. There's not many of these in the game, but I do like pulling them out every now and again. It's a nice way of mixing things up a bit. and aesthetically, I just really liked one level, one screen, and that's how the Flash game worked, of course. So the other story that they needed to be kind of continued and completed was this story of how John reacts to Sarah. Is that Sarah basically is John, but more so. And I really like the idea of him being massively intimidated at first by that and jealous, but actually that freeing him a little bit, because he doesn't need to be insecure, because there is someone who's demonstrably better at jumping than he is. And he kind of comes to terms with that and likes the idea of making other people feel awesome about themselves. He becomes much more selfless. He starts off very selfishly at the start of the game, and through his interactions with Sarah becomes the selfless character, which is really cool. and obviously at the very end of these levels where he's useless to this new. There are no yellow trigger zones later on. He is not going to be a part of this success, and he's kind of okay with that because he feels he's facilitated it and he's helped out with it. So that's a nice journey, and I like the way John progresses, and I like the way that his story ends.
Claire could not accept that this had all been futile. She was a superhero. There had to be a way. Not for her to get out. Red had been pretty clear on that, but there must be thousands of other AIs up there, unaware of their situation. Was there a way to help them?
Mentioned earlier the how late the checkpoints came in, and that was a very late addition to the game, and I think I pointed out that was pretty stupid. This is the mechanic I added 2 weeks before launch. I was playing for the first time. I tried FIFA. I was playing a football video game, not playing football, and I hated it, but I liked the idea of a ball, and it kind of rooted in my mind. I wanted to add a ball to Thomas, and I didn't want to. It wasn't going to go in too many levels, but I liked the idea of having one or two places where it fit. And I knew that during these kind of levels, you have been with the same characters for a little while, so introducing a new mechanic kind of felt logical and felt like it would be good for the player's kind of sanity. So the ball obviously became a diamond because curves do not exist in this universe. And it became quite a cool little physics object you bounce around. It caused quite a few headaches in terms of the way character introductions work, because physics in Thomas is not realistic. It's it's not realistic obviously because it's a video game jump, but actually more so than that in terms of when you carry characters, the fact that they don't slide off you, for example. So there's quite a bit of tweaks and fiddling going on behind the scenes to make the game feel the way I wanted it to feel, and the ball kind of contradicts a lot of that. So it became quite a bit more challenging than I thought it was going to be. But it actually adds, I think, a lot to these last few levels of with these characters, that you play with it in an interesting way. The fact that it's got the diagonals on it means that the way you interact with it is kind of akin to a football, that you're kind of bouncing it around the level and kind of specifically kind of hitting it from different sides in order to change its direction, things like that. And the big challenge actually was working out how to make it interact with the existing systems in the game. Making it a specific Switch variant was the kind of the perfect solution. That it felt logical, the player understood it, and it used it used a way of communicating that had been set up before in a nice way, and it fits into the existing systems. So this is similar to some of the stuff I do earlier in the game with multiple areas with different characters interacting indirectly. But what's nice about the ball was that it allowed me to make levels like this one, where you have different characters in different areas interacting with one object that gets moved around and passed around in different ways. And that was cool because it meant I could kind of separate the characters but have an object that moves between them. Because you don't directly control the ball, it becomes a kind of a passive object in the world that you have to interact with in interesting ways. It's basically kind of like, I guess, the companion cube from Portal, that it becomes something that takes on a meaning because it's something that's passed between different characters in this scene. So yeah, I really like this level. I never did get on the bottom right of the water, the particle effect kind of bleeds out of the wall, and I hate that. I never got that right, and I never worked out how to fix that problem. So yeah, half-finished game. So this was a point where I realised that there was an interesting possibility for an interaction between Sarah and Laura. I'd not played with those two before. Because Sarah has that mid-air jump, if she bounces once and then jumps in mid-air, you actually get some quite interesting movement out of her. So the idea of an environment where you could play with that, where you kind of combined the bounce with the secondary jump, felt cool, and that's what this level became. And it weirdly becomes Pong or Breakout or any of those kind of games, and in a way that I really like. It's kind of nostalgic, and it kind of works. It's fun. It's a little bit repetitive potentially, but I do like it, and I really like the nod to Pong.
Laura had been born special. She understood that now. She was created to help others. If her bounce could be passed on, then this would all have been worthwhile.
So this is another area where the characters are kind of divided. I had quite a bit of... it was quite an important piece of story here. This is the moment where Thomas does decide to basically change the world. So I deliberately kept this one pretty simple. This isn't a very challenging environment. It's more of just somewhere for you to interact with and exist for a little while until we get... so basically so you can hit the story beat. There's a couple of places in the game where I deliberately kind of slow the pace while something important's being said in the story. This is just a good example of one such place where it was important to kind of step back and let that dialogue from Danny, which I'm talking over right now, play out, so you can just see what's going on. I loved as a kid the game Mousetrap, and this is kind of my ode to Mousetrap. It's similar to a couple of the other levels that you've got kind of a sequence of different characters interacting with the same ball, but here it's much more specifically a journey that ball's going on from one end of the level to another, and that feels... I really like this level. It's, like I said, it's a nod to Mousetrap. It's kind of, it takes you in some interesting directions. There's also some quite cute ideas in there around the kind of, when that little lever that kind of flips the ball upwards that you catch in midair with James. Stuff like that just kind of grew out organically as the level was being designed. And it just feels nice. It feels sufficiently different in terms of the way you interact with it than any previous level. And it goes back to that kind of thing I was talking about earlier of the experiential element. That this level's so much more about how it feels than how challenging it is to work out.
John's massive jumps were dwarfed by Sarah. For the first time in his life, he felt humbled, not as good as someone else. He realised that he wanted to make every AI up there feel as heroic as he had. He liked the sound of that.
Okay, so this is, again, kind of still riffing off the idea of characters in separate rooms. But what's cool here is the approach has been to make those several rooms join together. So you're kind of opening up the space, and the characters kind of overlap in interesting ways. This one was really about the way the paths work for the characters. So you feel like you've really travelled this space. You take characters from one end to another. You take some characters just slightly over to the side. You've got Laura and Sarah there just kind of on their own, bouncing away as a nice little metronome for the level. You've got kind of an interesting journey for each of the characters in this level, and they're all overlapping. So it's a level that feels really good because they're separate, but they're also kind of overlapping constantly. And some of the puzzles require more than one of them at once. So this is the last environment for these characters, which was a controversial choice on my part, to say the least. This is the point where they essentially overcome what they are. They become heroes. Claire passes on her skill, Sarah passes on hers, Laura passes on hers. Oh my god, I've just realised that most of the characters that give up their powers selflessly are female. I don't know what I was trying to say there, except James. James is male, so that ruins any reading like that. And it's a nice moment where basically I hope that most players assume that this is a game about characters escaping. I hope that most players assume when they start the game that the last level will be Thomas escaping. And I like to subvert that. I like the fact that these characters don't get out, that they become part of the system, that they essentially give themselves so that the others can escape. There's a certain kind of heroism there. There's almost a mythical quality of them kind of sacrificing themselves for their kind. It also had to feel pretty epic, so that kind of final moment, where the characters step into the Matrix, there is a hopefully a cool feeling to that. They're also, the way they're arranged means that the characters whose traits are not carried over are not in the particle effect, not in the Matrix itself. They're kind of out to the side, which probably no one notices, but is a nice little moment for just kind of establishing what might happen next. I didn't want to make it clear how they were going to affect the world, so I couldn't say too much at this point, but I hope that on the second playthrough players kind of spot that all when they listen to this. And this is Grey. This is a new character. I'm not sure what players expect. I hope that the ones that have been paying attention kind of realise that the characters up to this point are now gone. I wonder if some of them think that this is going to be a continuation like before, but hopefully that loss kind of sets in. With Grey, there's a few things about Grey that are important. One is he's grey, and that's actually a functional thing, that all these characters are grey because their colours, once they start to gain their abilities, needed to show up. So grey became a logical thing. So they're all shades of grey. Having the first character introduced, coloured grey, I think kind of helps that to take a little bit longer to sink in, so players kind of just accept that the character's called Grey. Grey is an interesting character here because he is essentially the fourth. So Joe and Sam are the couple, kind of long-term couple of the game. They're interesting. They have a good relationship. Joe starts off a little bit, I guess, whiny, but comes around very quickly. And they're cool. The purpose of this level obviously is to kind of build on what we've just seen with Grey and introduce the idea of these two characters shifting their abilities, the fact that you can shift to an ability for one character without shifting the ability of the other, things like that, just kind of extrapolating on the learning from the previous level, hopefully in an environment that's pretty safe. The only skill that's required in this level is jumping, and obviously by this point you know how to jump. The whole game's kind of trained you in that. So again, hopefully kind of a safe environment in which to learn. Water obviously had to be there, so there had to be some hazard. But again, hopefully that's mitigated. This is an interesting environment. The plan here was to just basically play very briefly with what Grey can do. So here he's floating upwards. This is slightly different to anti-gravity because obviously anti-gravity you can jump. Whereas in this level, because it's water, you can't jump down from the ceiling. So it became a case of there's a challenge to that the player gets stuck or can find their way onto. They can't opt out of falling on. So this is things pacing up at this point. By this point, I'm less inclined to give people safe space to learn a new mechanic because at this point you've been playing the game for a while. You get it. I like to think that the challenges of the game are such that you accept that you're now going to be in danger from this point on. So here is obviously the big introduction of the fact that there can be more than one ability in a space. It's important to establish this kind of quite early on because I didn't want players to get confused by what happened if they had one ability and then they flipped to another ability. Do those abilities get combined? Do they then have both of those abilities? And it had to be a toggle for lots of reasons. It would have been very, very difficult to make levels fun. It would also have been very hard to allow players to disable an ability, which is obviously a big part of some of the puzzles later on. So yeah, with this one, it was really about teaching the player how to logically progress through a space where they had the opportunity to change their abilities, and also how they could combine two characters with different abilities to win. So you have to carry one character on another character here, you have to bounce one character on another character there. It's just a way of establishing that the relationship of characters becomes actually kind of even weirder than it has previously, because whereas before, obviously Laura's ability is static, she's always going to bounce things, whereas here you can kind of tweak what a character is. You can mod characters to be whatever you need them to be, and then that gets piled on with their kind of inherent traits in terms of their size and their jump height to make their own new characters. So there's lots of permutations that happen, and giving that in an environment that's kind of straightforward and kind of a logical linear progression. There's a reason the level's kind of really straightforward in terms of you go from right to left. It's just really simple, just to kind of let players work that out for themselves, but this time in a bit more of a dangerous environment. here I'm establishing Paul as his own character. There's a lot of reasons to do it on his own. Just kind of narratively, I just wanted to establish him before he's put into a scenario with Gray. The kind of the new mechanic here, gameplay-wise, is the fact that your relationship to the environment shifts. So as you progress through this level, sometimes you can float, sometimes you can't, and those shifts are forced on you. You don't have a choice. And what that does is that just kind of reiterates the fact that that shifting can be both a negative thing and a positive thing. And that's kind of important for later, because there will be points later where you have to avoid trigger zones in order to progress and to survive. So here's another example of a level that's kind of intentionally pretty simple, just to kind of allow the player to get used to a narrative point. So this is the point where Gray and Paul meet. The player needs to understand that Gray's starting to be a bit dodgy, and that he's going to betray Paul. That he's going to take all this information that Paul tells him and use it in a bad way. So it's kind of a simple level, but also there is some interesting spatial stuff going on that you have to kind of adjust the positions of Paul and Gray on those steps in order to get the bounce right. There's a few different ways of doing it, but it's kind of interesting. This is one that there's a lot of little different changes in the way you play this level, and I like that about it. I like that players can find their own solution. So this, and I do this a lot with these two characters, this is a kind of a journey level, so this is really just kind of progressing in a straightforward way from left to right. But hopefully what I'm going for is that this is actually a really interesting back and forth between the characters. So you're using them and switching their abilities up in order to get them to kind of leapfrog the other character into the position you need them in. So again, this is one that's not so much the puzzle as the feeling of it, and hopefully it's a fun journey. I want the player to really warm to these characters for reasons that should hopefully become very obvious.
Jo was growing to like her newfound abilities. Maybe Sam had done the right thing after all. It was getting a bit chilly though.
This is an opportunity to add a new trigger zone. So here we have obviously the double jump, which came from Sarah. This is to be honest, again, a quite straightforward environment, but just enough room that the player can work out what it is. There's a lot of communication going on in terms of hopefully explaining to you what each kind of thing does, what each different ability shift does. Obviously the colours are the same colours as the characters they're from. That's something that a lot of people don't actually pick up on. But it's still required to give these environments that kind of act as a sandbox for the player to work out what an ability shift does. Also, it's nice because it lets me do little character moments at the same time as introducing these new mechanics. So this level was came from a lot of different things. There's a couple of different mechanics, or not mechanics, but kind of interactions I wanted to play with here. One was the idea of a challenging trigger zone to get to that then makes the journey away from it easy. So right at the start, that water trigger zone is kind of hard to get to. You have to jump across lots of stepping stones, with the hazard and danger obviously being water, but then you get the water ability and then you just cruise through the water, and it's a nice moment where you feel empowered. So that's the first thing. The second thing I really wanted to play with was the idea of jumping into a trigger zone in midair and then using that ability, falling into a trigger zone and then using that ability while you were in the trigger zone, which I also do later on. So those two kind of little moments of so with this level, this was one that kind of grew out of the work I was doing on the other levels kind of around it. It's an example of a level that kind of the mechanics are there mainly because I just liked the way they interacted with each other. So there's a lot of really interesting overlapping kind of movements that you're doing in this environment, going back on yourself, changing ability mid-air, water not being a threat, because all the water in this level is obviously surrounded in that blue trigger zone. It means that water becomes a buoyant interaction. You actually have to use the buoyancy, I believe, for the first time in the game in order to hit the switch on the right. So there's a really kind of interesting interaction that takes place here that I wanted to play with, and I think kind of is quite fun. So Team Jump, I love Team Jump. Team Jump, the main purpose of Team Jump was to bring a little bit more humour into the game. I really wanted to have a group of characters who were a bit silly, a bit stupid, to be honest, and a bit fun. The other interesting thing with Team Jump is Team Jump were actually how this game originally was envisaged. When I first started thinking about these mechanics many years ago, I imagined kind of a group of characters all the same that you could basically kind of stack up and make kind of, I don't know the word for it, but those kind of gymnast poses where you stack up a bunch of people on at the same time. I wanted to do that kind of thing with characters in the game. And it kind of, in the context of the game I was thinking about, it didn't really work, but in this context it felt like actually adding a bunch of characters who were all essentially identical, and then getting the player to build them into towers or get them to help each other out became really interesting and became something that was a different style of gameplay. The other characters, because they're all so unique, you kind of think of them as unique entities and use them as such. Whereas with these, because they're all the same, I kind of hoped that they would be seen as one unit, and it became a case of almost having a transforming shape character in the game. And I'm a massive Transformers geek, so so that was fun. But yeah, I'm kind of I feel there's more puzzles to be done with.
They thought as one, they acted as one.
This is another one of my favourite levels, actually. There's a few things going on here that I just think are really cool. The main one, obviously, is there's current to the water. I programmed this into water the moment I made water. It was very easy. It was actually easier to make the water have a current to it and actually kind of pull the player across than it was to make the water buoyant. So they always had a movement to them, but I never really worked out a puzzle that kind of suited it. It always felt frustrating, or if you played with it, it felt like it was kind of helping you win by default. And this was a fun level to make because I got to use that current in an interesting way. So there's points where that current can be dangerous because it can knock you into things that hurt you. But the bit that I really love in this level, and it's something that I had to tweak things a little bit for, was there are moments where in order to win you have to intentionally sink into the water, but because the water has a currency of it, has a current going through it, you're then swept into a trigger zone which saves you, kind of an underwater save, which is something that doesn't exist in the rest of the game. I really worried that players wouldn't get it and they would kind of avoid it because they'd see it as dangerous. But by doing that, it just kind of breaks the mechanics in a really charming way that you kind of have to sacrifice your characters in order to, by default, be saved by that secondary trigger zone. And I'm just really chuffed with it. It came together. It felt really good. It was hard. I had to fiddle with some code to make it work, but it's a really nice moment. I'm really chuffed with. And then that's it really. There's so much going on in this level. It's just it's a very Thomas Was Alone level, and I'm really chuffed with it. So this is something, a mechanic that I kind of really wanted to bring in, which is the idea of avoiding trigger zones. The trigger zones become dangerous, just in and of themselves. So here you have, like, right at the top there at the end, you have those blank trigger zones, which are intersecting with the water as you swim across. You have to avoid those in order to not turn away from being buoyant and sink. You have to kind of avoid those. And it was really interesting to take something that the player has up to this point used, basically has empowered them, and then to make that a hazard that they have to avoid. And that's something that can only really be achieved once the players, getting the system. They've been through enough challenges with it. They understand how these trigger zones operate. You can start introducing these kind of abstract repurposing, I guess, of the existing mechanics. So it works really nicely, I think. Yeah, it's fun. And it becomes a little bit Frogger, which is quite charming. should apologise. I've just been reminded that the things I've been referring to for the entirety of this commentary as trigger zones are in fact shifters. It's fine, I wrote the script, but I forgot the words. So I've been reminded of that, so I will now endeavour to call them shifters. I apologise if I've been talking nonsense. I've probably been talking nonsense. Well done to you, by the way, for staying with me this long. A lot of people will have listened to the first few levels, had a good time, and then kind of moved on with their day. But you've really stuck it out, and that makes you special, and I appreciate that. Okay, so this environment. This environment is all about that shifting back and forth, but in a really kind of frequent way. It's kind of hopefully kind of a constant bounce back and forth. This was where I started to give in to my love of V, and wanted to be the indie game where you switch gravity. This is the next few levels are kind of ode to that. Anti-gravity, having anti-gravity in the game as well as blanks makes for some really interesting puzzles because you actually have the alternation that is in the game V. It's not player controlled in that way, but it means you can do some really interesting kind of spatial puzzles. This is a very slow introduction. The biggest thing here was to introduce anti-gravity in a way that didn't confuse the player and that they didn't have to make decisions too quickly. So every choice you make here has a delay on it. There's no shifters that switch you from blank to anti-gravity immediately. You always have a chance to decide on your tactic, and this is that moment. This is the bit where you kind of get stuck in an alternation loop. This was from the moment I knew I was going to have the shifters at the end of the game. This was kind of the first level that came to mind, mainly because it's ripped off from V. This idea of being forced to loop back and forth. Mine's a lot nicer. I don't kill you as much because I didn't want to. And yeah, you kind of progress these characters through. What's really interesting here is playing with the different distances these characters travel because of their differences in mass. They kind of each have a different way of interacting. So as you can see there, Joe and Sam move a lot more than Gray does, and that's cool because that means that you can have a lot of fun with the space. And as the blocks progress, you have different routes. It would surprise me massively if every player plays through this by taking the characters the same path. You've got a lot of options there, and I like the fact that you're going to find different ways through the space with each of the different characters, and probably different ways than everyone else who's played it. So yeah, it's one of those kind of freer puzzles that I quite like. So, I said before that the game is at its best when you have 2 or maybe 3 characters on screen at the same time. This level has, I believe, 9 characters, or is it 8? Might be 8. I think it's 8. I'll tell you why I think it's 9. It's because it was 9, or 10, one of the two. But I actually removed one of the team jump. That was mainly because on a computer keyboard, the numbers didn't go high enough that I could have a game which had that many characters in. I didn't really consider it, but I had to go without one of the team jump members, which would be fine if there wasn't a piece of dialogue in this level specifically referencing the fact that there are 5 members in team jump. Most people don't notice it unless I point it out. So yeah, hopefully I got away with it until you saw this. If you did get it, well done, you're very clever. Please don't tell anyone. It'll be our little secret. The environment is actually, this is probably the longest level in the game. This is one that most people take a good 5 to 10 minutes to work their way through. It's kind of frustrating as a result. I would, honestly, if I were to do it over, I would probably break this into several different levels and kind of allow you to go through each of these puzzles separately. But I didn't. So this is the level. It's quite long. Enjoy it. So, I said before that the game is at its best when you have 2 or maybe 3 characters on screen at the same time. This level has, I believe, 9 characters, or is it 8? Might be 8. I think it's 8. I'll tell you why I think it's 9. It's because it was 9. Or 10, one of the two, but I actually removed one of the team jump. That was mainly because on a computer keyboard the numbers didn't go high enough that I could have a game which had that many characters in. I didn't really consider it, but I had to go without one of the team jump members, which would be fine if there wasn't a piece of dialogue in this level specifically referencing the fact that there are 5 members in team jump. Most people don't notice it unless I point it out. So yeah, hopefully I got away with it until you saw this. If you did get it, well done, you're very clever. Please don't tell anyone, it'll be our little secret. The environment is actually, this is probably the longest level in the game. This is one that most people take a good 5 to 10 minutes to work their way through. It's kind of frustrating as a result. I would, honestly, if I were to do it over, I would probably break this into several different levels and kind of allow you to go through each of these puzzles separately. But I didn't. So this is the level. It's quite long. Enjoy it. So this level's all about annoying the player. So that really here the shifters are placed in such a way that basically every shifter in this map is there to kill you. So you have to be very careful about where you tread, about getting characters past difficult shifters that would cause them problems, and that becomes the focus for the player, is kind of avoiding shifters, but more importantly just playing in a way that's intelligently avoiding them so that you can get through the level. I really like this level, and it was horrible before checkpoints. With checkpoints, it's actually, I think, one of the more interesting levels, because you progress through it, you get a few setbacks, but you carry on. And yeah, it's cool. I like it. When I said there are a few levels that came to mind when I added the anti-gravity shifters to the game. The last one was the obvious kind of the V one, but this was the other one. Was the idea of a falling room where we get bands of anti-gravity and blanks kind of passing through the environment, which means that you're constantly alternating. All of your characters just alternate every few seconds between the two states. And I liked that. I liked the idea of playing around with the player's kind of environment and their expectations, and making it so that what is quite a straightforward map, if you were just in one of these states, becomes an interesting challenge because you have to kind of factor in the different options. This is also, just being a bit arrogant for a little while, this is a motif that I use in quite a few games. So a lot of games I've worked on have included a bit where a small box falls through a tunnel. I don't know why, I just like the shape of that. So for example, the last boss fight of Invincible Tiger, which was an XBLA game I worked on, that takes place in a very, very similar environment. It's a thing I try and get into as many games as I can because I just think it's aesthetically interesting and feels dramatic. So this is the penultimate level of the game, and yeah, the real thing here, I had to have the last kind of puzzle of the game. I didn't want to do that in the very last level of the game because I wanted the last level of the game to really just kind of tie up the story and be an experience kind of focus level rather than a puzzle. So this was the environment where I really wanted to play with the puzzle and play with those interactions. And the idea of the kind of, I called them during development, I think I called these the brush elevators or something, where basically you have a different shifter of each type that's been introduced, minus the anti-gravity for obvious reasons, there's no proof. And you can basically choose which character you want to go into which of those shifters to progress through. And while there's a bit of wiggle room, there is really only kind of one solution. There's a few different kind of tweaks. You can use character A or character B to do the same job. But I liked that. I liked the idea of one last puzzle which the player hopefully kind of would have to fiddle with and have to work out with just before I get to that kind of final story moment. Jumping had to be right. It's kind of the main way you interact in this game, obviously. I did a lot of research. I got kind of obsessive about it. It took me, I was still fiddling with the jump physics, I think, about 3 weeks. But this is a challenging jump. So this I played a lot of Uncharted before making this level, and it's kind of inspired by those kind of scripted moments in games. I didn't do as many in the game as I kind of expected to at the start, but there's a few. I played a lot of Uncharted before making this level, and it's kind of inspired by those kind of script. I played a lot of Uncharted. This level exists solely to allow the player to feel their way into John. This is a chance for you to basically make him jump properly for the first time, and hopefully because of the constraints in the last level, that feels awesome. And I actually use the word awesome in the narration just to push you in case that's not how you're feeling. You should, it's a very good game. And then, yeah, so you've now got access to this awesome jump, and you can do what you feel.
John decided to press the switch to let the little dots catch up with him. John cared for his new allies. You could tell from the sympathetic expression he'd practiced in the mirror all these years.
This is probably the most showy level. This is epic. This is the one that always goes in the trailer. I stole Rain from the method for doing Rain from Quickfingers, who's an awesome Unity dude who I'm now fortunate enough to work with. And it's cool. It's a big epic moment. This is much like those falling platforms earlier on. This is kind of one of those big semi-scripted sequences because the pace is defined by the water, so therefore I know that if a player's surviving, they are playing through at a certain speed. And it's cool. It also builds on the idea of carrying from earlier, but this time under pressure, so you have to move quicker and you haven't got time to think. And if you try and get Thomas off of Claire, you're going to run into problems very quickly. So there's that as well. So it's hopefully kind of a nice way of... This is probably the most showy level. This is epic. This is the one that always goes in the trailer. I stole Rain from the method for doing Rain from Quickfingers, who's an awesome Unity dude who I'm now fortunate enough to work with. And it's cool. It's a big epic moment. This is much like those falling platforms earlier on. This is kind of one of those big semi-scripted sequences because the pace is defined by the water, so therefore I know that if a player's surviving, they are playing through at a certain speed. And it's cool. It also builds on the idea of carrying from earlier, but this time under pressure, so you have to move quicker and you haven't got time to think. And if you try and get Thomas off of Claire, you're going to run into problems very quickly. So there's that as well. So it's hopefully kind of a nice way of solidifying all the learning the player's done about Claire up to this point. This is probably the most showy level. This is epic. This is the one that always goes in the trailer. I stole Rain from the method for doing Rain from Quickfingers, who's an awesome Unity dude who I'm now fortunate enough to work with. And it's cool. It's a big epic moment. This is much like those falling platforms earlier on. This is kind of one of those big semi-scripted sequences because the pace is defined by the water, so therefore I know that if a player's surviving, they are playing through at a certain speed. And it's cool. It also builds on the idea of carrying from earlier, but this time under pressure, so you have to move quicker and you haven't got time to think. And if you try and get Thomas off of Claire, you're going to run into problems very quickly. So there's that as well. So it's hopefully kind of a nice way. This is probably the most showy level. This is epic. This is the one that always goes in the trailer. this is where I introduced spikes. I needed a hazard. Well, I needed two things. I needed a hazard that that Claire couldn't get past, so not water, basically, something that she could get hurt by. And I also needed a hazard I could put on ceilings. I did actually try, because it's all in a virtual world. I was like, oh well, it's fine. I'll have upside down water, and it looked rubbish, as I'm sure you'd expect. So the spikes got added. I introduced them specifically just with Claire, just so you can, as a player, learn that Claire is actually going to be damaged by them, and it kind of just changes the relationship a little bit between Claire and the. I struggled to work out different puzzles involving Laura, because basically she makes things jump higher. That's a limited kind of scope, and one of the very kind of the cool ideas I had, I think, with Laura was specifically to keep her separate from the play space, so she couldn't interact directly with characters, but to have enough of her kind of poke out of a wall or be available to the other players that they could interact and get a benefit from her. And it allowed me to do things like this level, where you have kind of an indirect relationship spatially with between the two characters, and I really like it, actually. I think it's kind of interesting. I'd have liked to have done a few more of these.
She'd wonder what he was up to. Was he missing her? He wasn't saying very much.
So a lot like some of the other levels earlier on, this is a point where hopefully the player can kind of work out their own solutions to puzzles. They've got kind of an environment that goes through a loop, and they can kind of work out the way they want to approach it, and there's lots of different ways of doing it. The other big thing that's introduced here, I think, is the dotted lines. I think this is the first time you've seen them. The dotted lines were a problem that didn't really come up until this level, which was the idea of objects moving through barriers to. Thematically, Chris had to be taken by the Pixel Cloud on his own. He's going to grow and learn and be a lovely human being eventually. But for now, I kind of felt like it was important that he was still not quite there. He wasn't quite with the others, and he kind of was distant. And I kind of wanted that to be kind of symbolized, I guess, symbolized by the way he goes in the end. And that's cool. And then obviously around that came this awesome idea. I'm doing a lot of very arrogant statements during this. There's not many timed challenges in this game, or levels with a kind of a cut-off point, or anything really that kind of forces them to be fast. This is one of them. It was a real challenge. It's a struggle for a lot of players because players try and do it at the same time with both characters, which is very, very nearly impossible. What you need to do is separate. There's not many timed challenges in this game, or levels with a kind of a cut-off point, or anything really that kind of forces them to be fast. This is one of them. It was a real challenge. There's not many timed challenges in this game, or levels with a kind of a cut-off point, or anything really that kind of forces them to be fast. This is one of them. It was a real challenge. There's not many timed challenges in this game, or levels with a kind of a cut-off point, or anything really that kind of forces them to be fast. This is one of them. It was. There's not many timed challenges in this game, or levels with a kind of a cut-off point, or anything really that kind of forces them to be fast. This is one of them. It was a real challenge. It's a struggle for a lot of players because players try and do it at the same time with both characters, which is very, very nearly impossible. What you need to do is separate them out. And there's a problem here, I think, in terms of communication, that the player doesn't necessarily understand that they should do that, and will therefore become more and more frustrated repeating the same solution. So yeah, I'm not sure time puzzles are the best idea in this game, but it works. There's not many timed challenges in this game, or levels with a kind of a cut-off point, or anything really that kind of forces them to be fast. This is one of them. It was a real challenge. It's a struggle for a lot of players because there's not many timed challenges in this game, or levels with a kind of a cut-off point, there's not many timed challenges in this game, or levels with a kind of a cut-off point, there's not many timed challenges in this game, or levels with a kind of a cut-off point, or anything really that kind of forces them to be fast. This is one of them. There's not many timed challenges in this game, or levels with. There's not many timed challenges in this game, or levels with. There's not many timed challenges. This is James. He's another one of my favourite characters. He's intended to be the opposite of Thomas. He's kind of the anti-Thomas. This is something that lots of games do, and have the negative version of their main character. He's not evil. He's not mean in that way, but he's emotionally, hopefully, kind of the opposite. He's uncomfortable with the world. He's scared of the world. He's kind of he's not a massive fan of groups of people either. It's established very early on that maybe he was bullied or he's uncomfortable around others. So hopefully, kind of the complete inverse Thomas, which will become interesting when they meet. It's quite nice as well that he's physically the opposite of Thomas in terms of that he falls upwards, that he's got the anti-gravity. It's a nice way of bringing that mechanic in. And then little things like the fact that he's the opposite RGB value, which is a minor little nerdy thing to do, but one person in the world would realise prior to this commentary, and that's important, and that makes me feel clever at parties. I don't go to parties, I'm a game designer. And this is where Thomas comes back. I really ummed and ahed about how long I was going to leave it before you saw one of the original characters again. I was kind of worried that I love double jump. I really like the idea of getting a little bit of exploration into the game, so looking around and seeing what was going on. Obviously, that's kind of hard to do in a puzzle platformer without the player kind of feeling like they've missed the point or got lost. And the idea of hunting for things became cool. And I had these switches, so I thought, okay, I'll make a level where you move around, hunting down the switches and jumping on them in order to progress. And I made this level, but the problem is with the playtesters, they got lost. They got confused as to where they were meant to be going, what they were meant to be doing, and it frustrated people. And it didn't feel like a puzzle or a game level because it was so unguided, and it just felt boring. The kind of the spotlight was a weird side effect. I'd made spotlights for another part of the game, and then decided they weren't quite working, and removed them. And this was a perfect opportunity to find a new use for a spotlight. So it's kind of moving around at the. I really like the idea of getting a little bit of exploration into the game. So. So this is the penultimate level of the game, and yeah, the real thing here, I had to have the last kind of puzzle of the game. I didn't want to do that in the very last level of the game because I wanted the last level of the game to really just kind of tie up the story and be an experience kind of focus level rather than a puzzle. So this was the environment where I really wanted to play with the puzzle and play with those interactions. And the idea of the kind of, I called them during development, I think I called these the brush elevators or something, where basically you have a different shifter of each type that's been introduced, minus the anti-gravity for obvious reasons. There's no roof. And you can basically choose which character you want to go into which of those shifters to progress through. And while there's a bit of wiggle room, there is really only kind of one solution. There's a few different kind of tweaks. You can use character A or character B to do the same job. But I liked that. I liked the idea of one last puzzle which the player hopefully kind of would have to fiddle with and have to work out with just before I get to that kind of final story moment. And this is it. This is the last level of the game. This is the moment that the whole story's been leading up to. You've got two characters with the separate shifter abilities. I don't play with them too much within the bulk of the level. I wanted you to use these two characters in an interesting way together to progress through, because obviously that's what the whole game has been about. And this to me really is the moment where everything hopefully comes together. We've got a nice minimalist environment which has some cool effects work, which I'm chuffed with and I think works. We've got that incredible last piece of music that David did, which I genuinely think is just one of the most moving pieces of video game music I've ever heard. With this one, actually, all that clever procedural stuff that I mentioned earlier, we didn't do it on this one. This one needed to be controlled by David. This had to have exactly the progression that he had in mind, and that leads to a precision to the way that it's been put together and arranged. And it feels epic. And then Danny comes in, and Danny's performance brings it up as well. This is the kind of the crescendo of the game, and it's a perfect illustration of why the collaboration was so important. The number of different people who put work into this game, and I think it works. I think it works as a result of that. It's something I'm a little mindful in our little chats that we've been having as you play this game, that I maybe haven't mentioned those guys enough. This is a game that could not possibly exist without the collaboration of specifically David and Danny, and what they bring to the storytelling and the environment of this game. So yeah, they're pretty awesome. This level ends with obviously that final rise, and yeah, I've had a few comments. People feel the ending maybe isn't quite as clear as it could be. I will tell you now what I think the ending means. To my mind, these two characters find an escape. They exit the computer. They become fully aware. Well, they are fully aware, but they come out into the real world. What happens next? Well, that depends. I don't know yet. I've got some ideas. I've got some thoughts on what happens next, but essentially every sci-fi movie you ever watch with an AI in happens next. This is their emergence. These are the first precursor AIs to succeed. And that's my reading of the ending. But your reading might differ, and that's absolutely cool. And I like reading some of the theories online. Okay, this is me. I'm done. I've enjoyed our time together. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for buying the game. That was very nice of you. Thank you very much for finishing the game. That was also very nice of you, even with all those stair bits. And thank you very, very much for listening to this. And this is it. This is the last level of the game. This is the moment that the whole story's been leading up to. You've got two characters with the separate shifter abilities. I don't play with them too much within the bulk of the level. I wanted you to use these two characters in an interesting way together to progress through, because obviously that's what the whole game has been about. And this to me really is the moment where everything hopefully comes together. We've got a nice minimalist environment which has some cool effects work, which I'm chuffed with and I think works. So with this level, this was one that kind of grew out of the work I was doing on the other levels kind of around it. It's an example of a level that kind of the mechanics are there mainly because I just liked the way they interacted with each other. So there's a lot of really interesting overlapping kind of movements that you're doing in this environment. going back on yourself, using, changing ability mid-air, water not being a threat, because all the water in this level is obviously surrounded in that blue trigger zone. It means that water becomes a buoyant interaction. You actually have to use the buoyancy, I believe, for the first time in the game in order to hit the switch on the right. So there's a really kind of interesting interaction that takes place here that I wanted to play with. So here I'm establishing Paul as his own character. There's a lot of reasons to do it on his own. Just kind of narratively, I just wanted to establish him before he's put into a scenario with Gray. The kind of the new mechanic here, gameplay-wise, is the fact that your relationship to the environment shifts. So as you progress through this level, sometimes you can float, sometimes you can't, and those shifts are forced on you. You don't have a choice. And what that does is that just kind of reiterates the fact that that shifting can be both a negative thing and a positive thing. And that's kind of important for later, because there will be points later where you have to avoid trigger zones in order to progress and to survive.
Set off.
So here I'm establishing Paul as his own character. There's a lot of reasons to do it on his own. Just kind of narratively, I just wanted to establish him before he's put into a scenario with Gray. The kind of the new mechanic here, gameplay-wise, is the fact that your relationship to the environment shifts. So